We need freedom. We need freedom of speech, we need freedom of the press, we need freedom of association and freedom of conscience.
But even those things are not truly absolute, because as soon as you get a majority who doesn't want freedom of speech, they can legislate to restrict freedom of speech.
Of course they can.
I'm Rob Forsyth. Welcome to Liberalism in Question, a series from us at the CIS here, the Centre for Independent Studies. We examine issues and challenges around classical liberalism. Today we have a particularly interesting session because for the very first time I have two, not one, guests. And the reason is there's a dispute between them about an important issue. My guest is on my right here is Peter Kurti, who's the director of the Culture, Prosperity and Civil Society program here at the Centre for Independent Studies. And on my left is Jude Blik, who is a senior researcher with the Energy program here at CIS. Peter Kurti produced a paper called The Ties That Bind. And when Peter produced this, Jude Blik wrote, I've had the week off this week. I couldn't resist the analysis of your paper, and I have to say I respectfully and violently disagree. So welcome to a respectful and metaphorically violent discussion here on Liberalism in Question. Peter, in your paper, you're trying to deal with it with a problem, a question of how a society can be really diverse and yet in some sense hold together. What's your answer?
The first thing that needs to be said is that I'm actually writing about Australia, although it's addressed in terms of liberalism as a concept. I'm actually concerned about the place we've got to in Australia. And within the last 2 years, my sense is that social cohesion has come under particular strain in this country, and that we have groups of citizens who are not just agreeing to disagree with one another, but are disagreeing in quite violent, in the proper sense of the word terms. And I worry that a liberal society like Australia has got to the point where it needs to learn again how to manage disagreement in a way that allows social cohesion to be maintained, and that still allows Australia and all Australians to have a sense of belonging to a country called Australia.
When I saw that, I was quite disturbed, and I thought, they don't understand what it is to be an Australian. They haven't understood our values. Was that the right answer?
In part, yes. I think to answer your first question, in the paper I was looking to find the basis on which we can call ourselves Australians. Now, at one time, Australia was earlier in the 20th century was defined very much in terms of its Britishness, and Australia was seen as the country that looked to Britain as the mother country. Well, that's changed a great deal, and we are a long way from that. Multiculturalism is now a fact in this country. It's well established, and I certainly don't argue that multiculturalism should be dismantled. I don't even think it could be dismantled now. Given that, how do we live together in a society where people have values, some of which are incommensurable? And my argument is that we need to embrace the concept of value pluralism, which is not relativism, but just accept that there are plural values, and that we need to find a way, we need to have institutions and mechanisms that allow people with different values, and often incommensurable values, to live together in a cohesive, coherent and peaceful society.
So by value pluralism, you mean people with values which contradict each other. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And in our society, we're not going to all have the same values in a very deep sense.
That's right.
So normally the way to solve the question of unity, we have a society, we have this common values that unite us. You're saying that's not going to work anymore.
I don't think it is, because I think we have become too diverse as a society. And it's not that I bewail that or think we need to undo diversity, but that we need to accept that that's what Australia looks like now in the 21st century, and find a way of living with that. So the basis of national identity, for example, can't be ethnic nationalism. We're not all white Australians. We're just a very, very different society now. So what is the basis of our identity? And I argue that it's a sense of civic nationalism, which is grounded on in our institutions, in the constitution of the rule of law, of freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, and that we have to have and we have to have a commitment to those institutions.
So there are these sort of basic processes that you think can help hold it together, not a common history, not a common ethnic, not values in a great, not thick values, very thin few values and processes. You think that's going to hold us together?
I think it can hold us together. I hope that it will.
And you make recommendations about how we could go.
Yes.
Okay, that's the basic story. Now, you found that
Slightly, I disagreed.
Strongly disagreement. Now, but what do you agree and what do you don't agree with?
Yeah, so I agree. I think all of us would agree on the symptoms, which are growing discord, lack of cohesion, and an increasing confusion about what it means to call ourselves Australian. But I think that's also that's a very important. It's the important question. It's what we're discussing. So I agree with all of that. I agree that that multiculturalism is a fact, and that a divergence of values does exist in our society. What I would disagree with is whether or not we're allowed to question whether that's a good thing. And I think there's a couple of interesting terms that even just now you used, Peter, that I would try to unpick the loadedness of. So we use the word multiculturalism and diversity, and use the word exclusion as well in your paper. We can acknowledge them all as facts, but we can also step back and say, are those things good and healthy for our society? And that's kind of where I would begin. Yeah.
Peter's paper, I hope being fair to you, Peter, says in order to have a diverse society, we need to do this.
Yep.
You're challenging the premise
why diversity is desirable for our society in the first place, and because diversity, I think, masks the degree to which we are actually diverse. And this is one of my contentions, that look, if you and I want to go down to the shops and get some food, if we both want to eat pizza, good, but if I want to eat pizza and you want to eat ice cream, we've got a slightly bigger problem. And if I want to eat dirt and you want to eat pizza, it's an even bigger problem. All of those things are marked or masked by the term difference or diversity. And so I think liberalism helps us manage differences among people who are already mostly on about the same thing and differ at the margins. It doesn't help us manage differences between people who fundamentally disagree over the most basic things.
That's important. Your contention is that liberalism works when we've got a lot more in common than normally acknowledged.
Agree, and I think that's...
And that fundamental diversity is inconsistent with liberalism. A liberal society, I should say.
Yeah, inconsistent, just impractical. Like, liberalism doesn't work when mapped onto a society without a strong moral consensus. Yeah.
Whereas, Peter, you don't agree with that?
Well, I feel that, in a sense, Jude wants to close the stable door after the horse has bolted. And whether or not diversity is desirable, the fact is that we live in a diverse society. And my question is, given the society that we're living in, how are we going to live together, and how are we going to manage difference? Now, I don't think that diversity means, I certainly don't think it means relativism. It doesn't entail relativism, nor do I think it means that we have to learn to accept everything. I think there are limits to what it can be acceptable practices in Australia. For example, just to pick the examples that are often used, and I have used as well, child marriage. That is something that is not prohibited. Bigamy is not prohibited. And there are other practices that may be culturally appropriate in other societies. If you come to this country, you cannot pursue those practices.
So your value pluralism is not completely plural.
It's not relativism. No, it's plural.
No, but value pluralism must mean you accept many different values as having a place in the society. I have a value about bigamy. You don't.
Well,
you're saying, no, I can't practice, therefore you're saying there's a limit to the pluralism.
Well, not all illiberal values are acceptable. And what we have to do as a society is have guardrails that define those limits. And I'm not saying there are no guardrails. In fact, I talk about the fact that there are some practices that are simply not acceptable. There are other grey zones, which you see, for example, around religious schools and the freedom of religious schools to hire teachers who uphold the faith tradition of those schools, whatever that tradition is. So there are grey zones, or attitudes to vaccination, for example. There are grey zones which are more difficult to navigate, but there are limits to what is and is not acceptable, and I think we need to be clear about that.
But you're putting the limits much further away than where you want to put them.
Yes and no, because I think I would agree with you, Peter, that there are non-negotiables, that these guardrails exist. And I would simply say that, yes, they are necessary for our society, and they actually determine our national identity in a way. If you could put all of those down on a piece of paper, all of our non-negotiables, and I think there are more than what you're hinting at, that our society is actually full of unspoken no-go zones that they determine the range of acceptable behaviour, and that is our national identity in a way.
And these have come from our history.
It's an inherited moral culture. A lot of it comes from the Christian tradition. There are other things like freedom of speech, for instance, which isn't necessarily Christian, but just something that we've inherited as a culture and we now view as kind of an absolute fundamental. But I'd say that is the moral consensus that underpins.
So what are you disagreeing with then with Peter saying here? Well, what made you react that this is rubbish?
I don't think it's rubbish. When I read Peter's recommendation that what seems like we retreat from a values consensus, I thought to myself, well, no, we already have a values consensus. He acknowledges that there is a non-negotiable values consensus. So why don't we stand on that? And in fact, we don't need to. A values consensus is not a bad thing. Maybe that's what I was kind of reacting against.
Even if it means a reduction of diversity in the long run.
Yeah. I mean, excluding people who don't fit in with your non-negotiable values consensus is a good thing, because they're not on about what we're on about. And, child marriage or all of these things that we would currently think are abhorrent and just not on, we don't do that here. Excluding people who don't agree with that value consensus is not a bad thing for our society.
I would agree completely with that. And I wouldn't want to see supporters of Hamas being given permanent residence or even citizenship in this country, or even temporary residence for that matter. Somebody who supports an organization like Hamas is simply not going to be able to fit into Australian society and shouldn't be here. But I worry a bit about this idea of moral supremacy. I don't know what the arbiter of that moral supremacy is. I mean, are you talking about Christianity? Are you talking about a Judeo-Christian system of belief? Because
I wouldn't go that far, although I think largely our moral tradition is Christian, and it's worth noting how Christian it is, even in ways we don't acknowledge. So, for instance, one of our most preciously valued things in society is the fundamental dignity and worth of every human being. And I'd say that's a pretty Christian concept, especially when you look around the world and across history, it's not very widely practiced. Yeah, so some of those things are deeply Christian. I wouldn't pretend that I could sit here and list out all of the values in our value consensus and be able to justify them. It's more complex.
But let me ask you a question. Can non-Christian Australians be treated? Can we treat non-Christian Australians as equals?
Absolutely. Yeah. Because Christians treat non-Christians as equals.
It's not so much Christians as the values inherited from the Christian tradition. You're saying. I think we're not talking about a personal belief, but
sure,
something bigger than that, or deeper than that, or wider than that.
Yeah, it's being a Christian or not doesn't give you value under that value system. It's that we actually believe that applies to everyone, and I would say non-Christians believe these things just as much as we do. Maybe that's the point, is that as a society, we have these, like the dignity and worth of every single human being. Everyone believes that in our society. Whether or not, it doesn't matter where they come from or what faith they have, we expect people to believe and adhere to that particular value.
Is the difference between you guys, you have the same basic view, you just want to draw the lines at different places? Is that what's going on here?
I think
Or
it
is it
may.
more diametric?
I think it may be. I feel that that Jude is posing a sort of cultural monism that is not actually viable.
What do you mean by monism?
That there is one framework, there is one values framework that will work for Australia, and it's essentially the set of Judeo-Christian values. But you know, the thing is that Christians and Jews, for that matter, disagree amongst themselves about all kinds of things. So Christians, for example, disagree about the nature of homosexuality.
Sure.
And so, and they would say, well, those who are opposed to homosexuality would say, well, no, we are valuing the integrity of the individual person. We just think that X, Y, and Z practices are wrong and immoral. Other Christians will say, no, to take that position is actually to diminish the value of an individual, of the individual. So I wonder to what extent this realm of Christian values is actually coherent.
Can we step back from Christian to Australian values? The Australian way of life, the Australian myths, which include things like Anzac Day and fair go. These are part of that. Some of them are myths in the sense that they are deep beliefs that look at the nature of ourselves. They're more than temporary processes. They're in a kind of view of our own history, which may or may not be based on truth. That's not the point. It's a way of coming. So you come to Australia, you adopt the Australian way of life. This is what immigration was in the 50s and 60s. So much so that we called immigrants new Australians. Mm. Now, are you, Peter, saying that is no longer the way forward? Is that what you're saying, that it's got too diverse to talk about the Australian way of life or the Australian values?
Well, I'm not sure what the Australian way of life is in such a diverse country, but I think that there are important myths that define who we are as a people. I think Anzac Day is one of them. I happen to think Australia Day is one, but that would be very much disputed by others who would say that they share the Judeo-Christian values of contemporary Australia. But Australia Day is highly contested.
Right. So leaving aside where the values come from, would you agree that to the extent that we agree on values, so you used the word monism before, but would you agree that a society which is more united around its values, whatever those values are, is a more healthy one? Or would you disagree with that?
I'm less concerned about consensus around values. I'm more concerned that we learn to coexist with those whose values are different from ours, but do that in a way that doesn't tear at the social fabric of our society.
Yeah. This is the issue, is that I think values that are different from ours masks a bigger difference than I think we're ready to actually admit.
Well, can you think of some examples?
Well, anti-Semitism is the big one that's in the news a lot recently, right? We've just recently had a preacher who was sanctioned under Section 18C of our
Anti-Discrimination
Act.
Itself a controversial act at this point.
Sure,
yes.
but that is an example of a value that we don't tolerate at all, and it's a fundamental one. It's something that most people would react very strongly against and say.
What's the value that's been breached? Is it the value of freedom of speech?
It's the value of valuing and affording equality to every single person.
Even at the price of freedom of speech?
Yes. Yeah, well, but that's the interesting thing about our society at the moment, is that we can't quite make up our minds about that tension between those values. And so the state has made a decision here. We haven't got a values consensus, and so the state has to step in and arbitrate that particular difference, which I think is where liberalism tends to go when you can't agree on something.
Well, yes, I mean, I think liberalism strikes at coexistence, and that's what liberalism seeks to accomplish. I feel in the recent case of Mr. Haddad that although his views were distasteful, I feel by litigating around those issues, we've given him far greater prominence and amplified his message far more than we would have done had we not litigated, or the people who brought the action against him. I worry about these sorts of laws because I think once we start to restrict freedom of speech, it becomes much harder to police, and more people are likely to transgress those narrowing borders. And we find that something that we say we hold dear to, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of association, is compromised. That I think is a big worry. But just pick up on anti-Semitism, I think, because that's the presenting issue, and in essence, that's the issue for me that raised this. That raised my concern. I did some work on multiculturalism a number of years ago, and also on anti-Semitism. Now, today, it's a very different emotional climate. I think it's completely wrong and unacceptable for one group of Australians to publicly denounce and vilify and perpetrate acts of violence against another section of the Australian community. So anti-Semitism is not just unacceptable because it's about hating Jews, but it's the manifestation of that hatred that can, I think, contaminate the well of the rest of our society.
Sure. And I guess my key question is, how does a commitment to tolerance and our democratic institutions, how does it help us manage such deeply divergent values?
That's a very good question. I don't think there is a ready answer, but I think we have to live with. I don't think what I don't think we can do is say, well, we need to go back to an earlier age, or we need to reassert something else that can't be asserted now. So how do we work today with what we've got and with the people that we've got and the country that we've become?
Sure. Whether or not we can is a different issue to just at least recognizing where wrong turns have been made. In that, there are sections of our society who believe different things in very deeply divergent ways. Some of those are homegrown, and some of those have come in as a result of intentional policies of multicultural migration. In fact, a lot of them are homegrown. But whether or not we can do anything about that is a different question to what do we want to be in the future.
So, yeah. I mean, you, as I understand it, you would not be unhappy to have the immigration program look at people's. I'm trying to find a better word than values being overused here.
Sure.
But their basic outlook on life that is congruent with the Australian way of life, or and you wouldn't have a blind policy on these matters. You'd want to have selective immigration policy, the people more likely to get on with others who are already here.
Yeah, I'd say that's the.
Okay, and Peter, you don't think that's worth doing, or that's wrong to have a immigration policy which is selective? I guess once it's even our present policy is selective. We don't immigrate if you're a criminal. But do you want to try and reduce some of the diversity to a more manageable way by things like immigration policy?
Well, I don't want to reduce diversity, but I certainly am in favour of a discriminatory immigration policy, to the extent that I think any country does and needs to have the right to exclude certain people from within its borders.
Why don't you?
And I say that as a migrant to this.
I know, indeed. In fact, we're looking into this matter. Why do you favour diversity? Did you think you're not going to want to? There's a question of can it be reduced, and you said it. You've said, I think your argument is it's gone too far gone. We've got to find a way to live with it. Right? That's your basic argument. But you also think diversity is a good thing? If so, why? Because I think Jude's got some question marks about diversity.
I think diversity is fine, but there have to be parameters which set the boundaries of our life together. I don't think they are moral parameters primarily. I think they are institutional parameters. And
what's the difference? That's important for your paper.
Because I think we can disagree we can take a different moral stand on different issues, homosexuality.
What's the institutional? I understand the moral, but what's the alternative?
The alternative, well, it's not as much an alternative, but rather than trying to address diversity from a moral perspective, I think we need to address the importance of preserving institutions, because what we need are strong institutions that allow us to live with difference and that allow us to manage coexistence safely and effectively.
What do you have in mind when you say institutions?
I'm talking about the rule of law. I'm talking about respect for the authority of the state. I'm talking about the impartial administration of justice and a willingness on the part of the state to stand up for the well-being and the values of every Australian, which is not to say they endorse the values, but that protect the right and uphold the right of people to live by their own sets of values, to the extent that they are not violent, they're not incompatible with life in society.
Right. I noticed that in your paper you quote John Gray, the English philosopher, about looking for what's the phrase? He looked for a modus vivendi, a way of getting on.
Correct.
And that's all he's going for. Nothing more than that. Is that what you're basically saying? All we've got left now is a way of getting on with different...
Well, it's not all that we've got left. I think to put it in those terms is to canvass despair. I think it's to recognize that in any human society, certainly in a Western human society, there are going to be people with irreconcilable and incommensurable values, and that what we need to find is a way of life, a modus vivendi. And Gray was taught by Isaiah Berlin, who was who spoke and wrote extensively and very eloquently about value pluralism and about the fact that we need to accept that there are some things that are simply not going to fit together. But if we're going to live together in a society, we have to find a way of coexisting.
Your response?
I think we can live together. I think the more we can agree, the better. And to that end, I mean, sort of talked about immigration before. That's why I would discriminate for the people who are on about what we're on about. I don't think a society that has such deeply divergent values is a healthy one. Whether or not we can make it work and we have to make it work is another question. But yeah, I see that as a fundamentally a tragedy.
So what example would you give of values that are deeply incompatible?
Okay, this one is a homegrown one, but I think abortion is an interesting one, that a large proportion of our society feels very strongly that is murder. Another proportion thinks the exact opposite. We have to live together in a society where we have viscerally, kind of gut level feelings of revulsion or disgust for the other side of that argument because of the moral
of the act, for the act.
Yeah, for what's at stake or what people believe is at stake. So that's a really large value divergence. And the state can't be neutral on that necessarily. It is either going to be legal or illegal. And so the state has to, these divergences are always going to bubble up to the political realm, and the state is going to be asked to rule on it in one way or another. And that will then become an exercise of power then, political power according to whoever's got the majority in a democracy. And so that's an example of how a deep moral division becomes an acrimonious wielding of power that I don't think necessarily our liberal institutions help us manage that well.
I think that may well be true. But of course, there are, just to take one faith tradition, Christians take different views on abortion. There are Christians who are in favor of it, and there are Christians who oppose it.
So that is not my point. My point is that in a society with such a large divergence of values over so many things that so many people find very important, you're going to end up with more acrimony, more division, and you're going to end up with...
But don't you end up, in fact, this is a point I think Peter made in his paper, he may be right, that if the state is too powerful, it favours one side over the other, ultimately.
Yep.
It has a minority view and a majority view.
Yep.
And it may, therefore, if you think legalisation of abortion is making a moral statement about it, that's what, because legality and morality are different here, of course.
Sure.
Not unrelated. The fact that it's lawful means that the state is saying those who believe it's reproductive health and not murder are the ones that we're favouring.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, the state has actually come down on one side, almost.
Definitely.
So there's no longer acrimony. We've got state reduction of diversity.
But that leaves whoever is on the outside or the other side of that opinion.
Of course, exactly.
Yeah.
One of your concerns, I noticed, was that if we try and have a way of life that is so enforced or encouraged, it reduces diversity, right? That's why you want to keep diversity by this use of institutional process to hold us together. Am I right? Is that what you said in your paper? With it? And my question is this because we've got no other choice or because diversity is good in itself? Is your paper based upon the belief, look, we may not like it, but here we are, or this actually is a better way to run a society?
It's an interesting question. Is diversity a good thing in itself?
You hear it said all the time, our strength is our diversity. That's a common slogan, but really, is it ever interrogated?
Well, I think that's used in a political way to in an attempt to conceal the cracks that the mismanagement of diversity is opening up in our society. So I think politicians can get very defensive about this and say, no, that diversity is our strength. But they don't really define diversity, and they certainly don't define strength. But just coming back to this question of the state, because I think this is an important point, because it makes it sound as though the state's some sort of monolithic entity that will make a decision on Tuesday that abortion is okay, and that it will be enacted in, say, the state of New South Wales. But what happens is that in a country like Australia, where there is compulsory voting and every citizen has the right to vote, people return elected representatives to Parliament. Those elected representatives make a decision with which a segment of the population may well disagree, and clearly does disagree. And we have to live with the decision of the Parliament, and we have to live with the fact of our own disagreement, which can be quite strong and passionately felt. Abortion is one issue, euthanasia is another issue. There are these strong, moral issues around which people feel.
Where the Jews have too much power in society is another issue.
Yeah, you're opening yourself up then to relativism, in that that would then leave a door open for whoever has a democratic majority to legislate anything that we would currently find abhorrent.
Yes, I think that's true. It does. And I think that's why it's so important to campaign for people who take a strong moral position against these moves to be able to campaign openly. This is why we need freedom. We need freedom of speech. We need freedom of the press. We need freedom of association and freedom of conscience. Oh, yes. No, I think that
But even those things are not truly absolute, because as soon as you get a majority who doesn't want freedom of speech, they can legislate to restrict freedom of speech.
They can. Yes, they can.
The question not whether they can. That's the question is, in a liberal society, what is the best way to have a society? And it plainly cannot be simple majoritarianism. The majority always wins. That is the essence of a liberal society, is in fact protection of individuals and minorities, which is why.
But what you're touching on is what various philosophers have called the tyranny of the majority. Something that Tocqueville talked about, and I think that is a real challenge.
A constitution.
Yeah, it's a real challenge. The tyranny of the majority. What do we do? How do we live in a society where now, for example, with the legalization of euthanasia, we've actually given doctors the power to kill patients? Proponents of euthanasia hate it being framed in those terms, but that's what it is. Now, how do we do that? I think that we have to continue to speak about it. And we have to make known our opposition and the reasons for our opposition, and get people to think again, because there will be elections, there'll be new MPs, there is the opportunity to overturn law. Now, that is an example, in my view, of the way in which the civic sense in which I'm using national identity is exercised. That's the way in which civic identity is.
Is this a basic? Is it? Forgive me if I'm trivializing it. Is it that we must agree to disagree? Is that what you're talking about by civic nationalism?
No, the civic base of national identity is an acceptance of the structures. In part, it's an acceptance of the structures by which we're governed. So it's respect for the rule of law. So once a piece of legislation has been passed, once the courts have made a decision, once a verdict has been returned, for example, we need to accept that this is the law. We can write about it, we can campaign about it, but we can't disobey the law. I mean, there are exceptions because of conscientious objection, and sometimes acts of civil disobedience are an important way of challenging law. But I think we have to accept that the legal process, because if the law had gone our way, on whatever matter it is.
Whoever our is in that sentence.
Whoever our is in that sentence, that's right. But if suppose the law had changed in a way that favoured my point of view and that didn't favour Jude's, the tables would have been switched, and it would now be Jude who would be unhappy with.
So there needs to be a loyalty to the process.
There does indeed. That's really what I mean by the civic basis of national identity. It can't be an ethnic basis, and I don't think it can be a moral basis, because I think there is too much moral divergence.
There's got to be some sense of an us, though. I mean, what is the motivation to respect that? To respect the rule of law.
That's a very important question.
What holds us together, I think, Peter, is my question, on your understanding.
I think what holds us together is a commitment to those processes and to those institutions that allow us to coexist in the face of moral difference and moral diversity. It's subscribing to what you referred to earlier as the myths that underpin the Australian way of life.
Oh, right. So you go that far. They are not just formal, but they can have a shape of a national shape.
Indeed.
I see.
I would agree. I think all of that's very important. I particularly agree with your civic, the civil society take, in that the realm for trying to achieve moral consensus is not the state; it is civil society. It's arguing through wherever, and it's the church, and it's the family, and it's the academy. So I would agree with that, and then the fundamentals that you were just talking about, this commitment to those institutions, I would say that they aren't just institutions. They are deeply held core values, non-negotiable absolutes for us. And that is part of our national identity. So I would agree with that too.
I think we're using language slightly differently, but I think we're agreeing.
Yep.
The challenge is, and you use it about grey areas, non-negotiable areas, there are certain parts of moral pluralism which tend to overthrow those very values. I believe the society is illegitimate. Supposing I believed that Western society was a sham, that we stole the land from the Indigenous people, yep. It has no legitimacy, I'm therefore perfectly right to rise up against it. Or supposing I believe that you are all unbelievers, and it is my job to use any method I can to impose upon you the law of God, take to extreme views. Now, these are views which are held in this country, aren't they?
They are.
What should we do about it?
I think we have to speak out about the threat that they pose.
So we don't accept moral pluralism on those grounds then, at that point.
Well, we have to accept it. I think what we can do is point to the danger that's posed by those views. I don't think those views are
Are they right or wrong, or just bad or good? I mean, are they?
Put it another way. I'd rather come at it this way. I think, because I agree with you, and I think this one of the threats posed by the whole post-colonialist movement, the settler colonialist movement, the use in this country of acknowledgements to country. I understand the sentiment behind that, but the threat that poses arises because they effectively question the legitimacy of the country, the legitimacy of the state, and somehow imply that we ought not to be here and that Australia as a state is illegitimate.
But people do hold such views.
They do.
And they're not saying they're wrong. You're saying they're unhelpful, they're dangerous.
I believe that they threaten the legitimacy. They threaten to undermine the legitimacy of the state.
Correct.
But if they are held peacefully...
So should they say those?
If they are held peacefully, then I accept the right of those people to pronounce acknowledgement of the country. What I want to reserve, for example, in this instance, would be the right to say why I think that's wrong and inappropriate.
Sure. And maybe we could agree on this, but also that it would be unhelpful to import those people who don't think our state is legitimate.
We don't need to. I think a lot of them are homegrown.
Yeah, that's true as well. Did you know that in 1951, Menzies brought a referendum to try and ban the Marxist Party?
Communist Party,
yes,
indeed. Very
so, I mean, that's an example of the country where we thought, he did very narrowly, though, 0.5%, I think, or something was in it. But that's an example of a value system that believes the state or our institutions are illegitimate, that we shouldn't ever accept, in his opinion.
And this is the problem of every liberal society: how you deal with illiberal elements in the society.
Yes.
And
my question is our society strong enough to reject
illiberal elements?
I think my fear is that it's weakening.
Yeah.
A good example, I come from the United Kingdom, from England, and a good example would be the arrival of the Irish in Australia. There would be Catholic Irish who hail from the Republic of Ireland, who would feel very strongly about the place of the British or the English in the island of Ireland. There will be Ulstermen who feel very strongly about about their attachment to the British Crown. Now, and that's been played out, as we know, in very violent ways in Ireland and in the United Kingdom. You can bring those views with you to Australia, but what you don't do is play out foreign conflicts on these shores. So it's not that you arrive in this country, or that, we're only going to have nationalists, or we're only going to have Republicans. You can have nationalists and Republicans who come here, but once they come here, and this is just to give sort of an historic example, once you come here, whether you're a Republican or a nationalist, you commit to being in Australia and you don't import foreign conflicts. What I think has happened around the Israel-Gaza situation is that a conflict that bears that is being waged thousands and thousands of kilometers from here is being played out on the streets of our cities, and that is threatening our social cohesion.
And it occurred also during the Balkan battles.
It did.
The Balkan Wars. It's very easy to bring so-called foreign conflicts to your new country because your heart is often still back home.
And it's not to say that you no longer care about those issues, and it's no longer to say that you no longer have a position on those issues, but you don't play them out in the streets of our cities. And I think people who are neither Jewish nor have any interest in the politics of the Middle East, but who are committed Australians, are disturbed by what we've been seeing since the 7th of October 2023, because they would say, that's not the Australia I know. That's not the Australia I grew up in. There was a willingness to accept people from overseas, and who in time became, to use a loaded word, assimilated. But there was a commitment to their new home, a commitment to the country, and that was what was expected of Australians.
And is that inconsistent with the notion of multiculturalism? You're now saying you want a monoculture. You've returned, have you not?
Well, what do you mean?
Well, what it is to be an Australian implies there is a way to be an Australian, not a multicultural society.
I think multiculturalism is a difficult term. I use the word because that's a word that's in play. Other scholars would prefer to talk about multiculturality rather than multiculturalism. I think that we have to use the language of multiculturalism because it's been official Australian policy for 50, 60 years.
Which is in what the reality rather than understand the word being a difficult one.
I think that the reality is to use a rather pithy phrase of our former colleague Jeremy Sammett, that you can come to this country, but it's got to be Hamas and not Hamas.
Now, we've talked for a while about the question of, as I'm listening to you both interrogate, I'm seeing a lot more in common than I first thought when I read your respect for the violent. Maybe the respect for being the violent. And that is, you both accept an irreducible fact of diversity, and many of the diversity of viewpoints are some which you personally would rather not be in the sense of you think people are wrong about a number of key how to live life. But it's a fact of life and not going to be removed by government fear. We can't have that. You also both agree that there are certain limits where the state has to intervene. I'm not sure we even disagree about where they are at the moment, right?
Yeah, I guess you're right. Yeah,
the thing is, you're favouring. You would like to see less diversity on some of these matters. You think they're unhelpful. You're saying, Peter, well, if they're here, let's try and find a way to make them work and not get any worse.
Correct.
Have I got you right?
Sure.
I've done it.
Because the strength of liberal institutions lies in that they don't require moral or theological consensus, but they have to regulate and marshal difference in order that we can coexist peacefully.
liberalism tends to put the big questions not from the state, that's you, but the little questions about how to live together. Liberalism grew up in the results of the wars of the 16th, 17th centuries in Europe, and in a sense were a revulsion against theological top-down societies and against the power of the church in some ways and against the power of monarchy. And yet at the same time, I think it's still very much rooted in that particular cultural context and therefore assumes certain values that are there. And the great question is, how will it work when can those values be kept in order that liberalism does survive and not be eaten away by the own diversity that it's allowing? I think that is the great question that liberalism faces in the world today.
Yeah, and I would just emphasize that those values are very important, that we need that bedrock of values that we all respect.
I think we'll have to leave it on that note of almost agreement.
Violent agreement.
Violent agreement. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Jude. And thank you for watching this rather diverse, if I say so, edition of Liberalism in Question.